Good evening, everyone. It's been a challenging time once again on campus, and I'd say really on campuses throughout the country. It's a pleasure this evening to have with us a scholar who's thought a lot about how to build a campus community and how to have real dialogue, as well as three wonderful, thoughtful Harvard students to talk about their own experiences and reflect a bit on theory and practice and how that all works together. I'll introduce all of them here. First, we have Professor Danielle Allen. She is James Bryant Conant University Professor at Harvard University and Director of the Allen Lab for Democracy Renovation at Harvard Kennedy School's Ash Center for Democratic Governance and Innovation. She's a professor of political philosophy, ethics, and public policy. She's also a seasoned nonprofit leader, democracy advocate, tech ethicist, distinguished author, and mom. She's the author of many books and writes a column on constitutional democracy for the Washington Post. Outside of the university, she is founder and president of Partners in Democracy, where she continues to advocate for democracy reform to create greater voice and access in our democracy and drive progress towards a new social contract that serves and includes us all. Danielle is also a member of the task force on combating anti-Semitism, as well as the task force on combating anti-Muslim and anti-Arab bias. Danielle, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Danny. It's good to be here. I really appreciate it.
I will say a lot of people, I think, have shied away from this moment, and you've been bold and courageous in really leaning into it and being a leading voice. And so I want to start off by acknowledging and expressing my gratitude that you've done so.
Oh, thank you. That's very generous. I appreciate it. I mean, this has just been a super hard and painful time, as you know. I don't have to tell you that. And, it's an important time for us all, I think, to reconsider some of our basic fundamentals. And so it seems to me important to say that and to try to make space for having that conversation. So I'm not sure I've found the right path exactly to doing that yet, but I'm trying. Grateful to Jacob here for helping a little bit with, some efforts in the Crimson, and look forward to this conversation.
Great, thank you. And I'll introduce our students. You've already begun to introduce Jacob. Jacob Miller is a junior studying math with a concurrent master's in statistics. He's the former president of Harvard Hillel and is currently co-chair of the Crimson's editorial board, where he has been editing Danielle's recent pieces for the Crimson. We also have with us Danny Denberg, who is a sophomore studying computer science. He's the co-founder of Chorus, which is the new Jewish a cappella group, and is the Israel chair of Harvard Hillel's student board. And last but not least, we have Elian Zacher, who's a senior earning both a bachelor's and a master's degree in electrical and computer engineering. She captained the varsity rugby team, leading the team to an undefeated season and the NCAA national and Ivy League championships. Before attending Harvard, she served as a first sergeant in the Unit 8200 of the Israeli Defense Forces. Welcome to all of you. Just in the structure for this evening is going to be as follows. We'll begin with some conversation. I'll be asking Danielle to share a bit of her vision for how Harvard and really universities all over the place should function. And then we're going to hear direct personal experiences from our students responding to some of what Danielle has shared. So Danielle, I want to begin with you. What are we doing here? What is the purpose or the mission of Harvard?
I appreciate that, Danny, and I appreciate your making space for such an important conversation. The mission, there's no sort of rocket science or nothing novel to it, really, right? I mean, the mission is pursuit of truth, inquiry, and doing both of those things in the common interest, in service of the public good. Now, as we do that, it's also important that we bring all perspectives to campus. So the best ways of approaching truth, achieving open inquiry, depends on a sort of commitment to pluralism. That's a word I'm trying to sort of put into the conversation more than has been in the conversation in the past. And to talk about pluralism is to talk about building campuses that, as Ibu Patel says, are for folks who are diverse in their identities and also divergent in their ideologies. Yet we have the capacity to activate everybody's potential equally. and to make intellectual space, keep the intellectual space wide open for hard conversations about really tough subjects, not let conversations get shut down because people disagree with each other. So I think that cluster of ideas, that kind of core commitment to truth seeking, resting on a foundation of pluralism, social pluralism, really committed to, again, diversity of identity and divergence in ideology, and making space for hard conversations.
Now, you've written recently about the university's value statement, which is probably something that very few of us have even heard of.
Yeah.
And within that, there are a number of stated core values. So can you talk a little bit about that statement and what are those core values?
Sure. Yeah, no, it's a sort of interesting question, this one about the university's values statement. As Jacob knows, it's a bit of a, bee in my bonnet, basically. I'm kind of obsessed with this document. And I'm obsessed with it, actually, partly because nobody knows about its existence. So the first version was produced in, I think, 2002 in the Summers administration. And then when I and others were working on the Inclusion and Belonging Task Force in the years from 2016 to 2018, when we started our work, we thought, well, the first thing we have to do is really consider the university's values. And then somebody who was staffing the task force said, oh, look, well, there is actually a values statement. And there was apparently only one copy. And, we were told in a poster in the basement of Massachusetts Hall. So we thought, well, that's interesting. And that kind of means, the values aren't sort of doing their work. So we did a little work to think about their content, but then also really hoped that they would be kind of lifted up and made the sort of centerpiece of the life of the university. So it didn't exactly happen in the wake of that task force. So I'm sort of trying to do that now a little bit. But it starts with respect for the dignity, basic human dignity and differences of one another. It is about being responsible for one's conduct in the community. It is about conscientious pursuit of excellence. It is about being responsible for the bonds and bridges through which we grow and learn together. I've left the second one off. I think I gave you 1, 3, 4, and 5. So I will go grab the second one in a second to make sure you have the whole set.
Thank you. Are there ways in which that you find that these values are ever in conflict with one another? And given also that, well, I want to hear that first, then I'll ask you another question.
Yeah. So it's a great question. I don't actually honestly really think that these values are in conflict with each other. I think they're mutually reinforcing fundamentally. So at the end of the day, the need to pursue our work, pursue excellence, is also about recognizing that everybody on our campus has the capacity to deliver in that regard. And so that recognition of what everybody has to deliver is that key, aspect of respect that the value statement starts out with. And then, there's the question of what does it mean to actually show respect, to act on respect? And that's a combination of that, again, taking responsibility for the bonds and bridges we have with one another. It's about honesty and integrity. That's the second one that I was forgetting there for a second. And it's also about taking accountability, for our actions and conduct if and when we actually stray from those core values. So I think that core idea of respecting the rights, differences, and dignity of others is then, we're told sort of what the actions are that go with that respect in the rest of the values.
And you've written that academic freedom and free speech are both sort of integral to accomplishing the university's mission. First, can you distinguish for us the difference between academic freedom and free speech, because they're often confused?
Sure. No, they are. We often use them interchangeably. And academic freedom, importantly, is the sort of set of principles that grow out of and govern academic spaces, universities. And their purpose is to protect freedom to teach, freedom to learn. So without external interference in terms of the decisions that teachers and learners make about what to study, how to think, and the like. So these are protections of the space of inquiry, importantly. They are not actually spaces for saying anything and everything. We bring standards of scholarly judgment to the space of academic freedom, and things get, ruled out. A student can get, an F on a paper, right? And that we can sort of communicate, nope, that doesn't work. You're going to have to try again. Doesn't happen very often at Harvard, I will admit, with the grade inflation and the like, but nonetheless, in principle, the point is those evaluations are part of academic freedom. In contrast, the right of free speech is a right that we hold against our governments, against the potential that our government might try to interfere with our speech in the public sphere. And that is sort of layered on top of academic freedom in university contexts. Here, as a private university, we really make some of our spaces available on campus for those kind of public fora. And as a matter really of a kind of granting of a privilege, say, yes, we'll take the full First Amendment range of free speech as being what we're going to protect in those public fora spaces. But that is a different kind of speech protection than the core academic freedom protection.
And you've written that just because something is permitted to be stated doesn't mean it should be said. So how do you think about the difference between permitted speech and good versus bad speech that falls within the realm of that which is permitted?
No, absolutely. I mean, I'll be honest, my training, I'm a combination of a classicist and a political scientist. Studied both fields and have done a lot of work with Aristotle. And what you're actually getting in that distinction between good and bad speech is sort of Danielle's 21st century version of Aristotle, in truth, and sort of the question of the art of rhetoric. And the art of rhetoric is not an art about tricking people, slippery stuff or sophistical things. It's actually an art of good speech. And what is good speech? Good speech is intellectually responsible, it's morally responsible, and it's emotionally responsible. And the purpose of speech in any public context is to make the community that you're speaking in better off after you've spoken than before you spoke. It's just as simple as that. And that responsibility to make a community better off through one's speech acts, as I said, it involves intellectual, moral, and emotional dimensions. And it's really important to learn how to be good at all of those dimensions of speech.
And how does the university inculcate that? I mean, whose responsibility is it when, I guess, to teach that kind of proper speech? And also, where is their accountability or discipline, or how should a university handle bad speech that is still permitted?
Yeah, no, I mean, obviously, these are the really tricky and hard questions we've all been wrestling with this year and have had such a sense of confusion about and frustration and sort of dispiriting sense of things not being appropriately addressed often. I'm going to give you a two-part answer. The first sort of historical, the funny thing is there's sort of little buried bits of Harvard history that connect to old approaches to this that are interesting. So John Quincy Adams, one of this country's presidents, was also a professor at Harvard. And he was, in fact, the first professor of rhetoric at Harvard and published a massive textbook on exactly this question of what counts as good speech. So this point about being responsible for the intellectual, moral, and emotional dimensions of speech it's a very old one. The trouble is, in a certain sense, the disciplines and the ways we used to go about teaching these arts of rhetoric and taking responsibility for one's speech have fallen away. They're not really a part any longer of our core disciplines or what we teach. So in that regard, the question that you're asking is really sort of in modern conditions, in 21st century conditions, how do we make room for this kind of instruction again? And the very specific way that we sought to do this during my term of service as director of the Edmund and Lily Saffer Center for Ethics was by building what we called our civil disagreement program. And we pulled together groups of students and did this in collaboration with other colleges and universities as well, with a huge variety of backgrounds and viewpoint diverse backgrounds, as well as other kinds of difference. But the important thing was then not just that we pulled together a group of students from very different backgrounds, but they experienced periods of training, honestly, learning how to talk with each other. But where that was about these dimensions of what does it mean to be a good listener? Are you in a position where you can repeat back what the other person said and test whether you've understood it correctly? How do you start to build a foundation of trustworthiness before you actually get into a place of trying to tackle a really hard issue where people disagree with each other? So we really thought that there was, a sort of a syllabus in effect that needed to be developed to help students learn skills that are, at this point, not modeled in our public sphere either, let alone not taught.
And I guess I'm curious, how would you assess what's been going on this whole year and more recently in terms of achieving this vision? Where do you
Yeah.
think you see success, where failure, what are some of the stumbling blocks that have led to sort of falling short?
No, again, I appreciate that. I mean, it's just, as I said, it's been an incredibly painful year, and the challenges have had like a lot of different layers and levels. So, for example, for starters, we've had a basic challenge on this campus of not having clarity about what our core policies are. So, in an ideal world, like if I could wave a magic wand, colleges and universities would have a very clear policy structure that establishes the protections of academic freedom, protects free speech, but also makes clear what counts as violations of time, manner, and place requirements for free speech. And then real clarity about the enforcement mechanism so that when you do have violations of those basic policies, somebody shouting down a speaker and things like that, those enforcement mechanisms kick right in. So that's your wave your magic wand kind of world, okay? But we haven't had that. We've had a lot of policy confusion. I think that's been our kind of first problem. So you'll remember in the fall, right, there was an experience of really there being somewhat different policies around protests in the different schools on campus. And because the policies were different in different schools, nobody really knew what the rules were. And when nobody knows what the rules are, you can't actually really have a stable system of ensuring that enforcement happens when a sanction is necessary. Nor can you actually do a good job of teaching and engaging in cases where people's speech, isn't intellectually, morally, or emotionally responsible, but is in fact permissible. It's hard to engage too, because you're actually you just don't know which category are things in. Like, is it permissible? Is it impermissible? Like, I just have no idea. So in that regard, I think, our policy instability on this campus, which I think has been at the heart of our problem, has come from two things. One, I would say, has come from conceptual instability. Again, not recognizing the difference between academic freedom and free speech, not recognizing the fact that, there are violations that involve speech things that require sanctions, not recognizing that some stuff is permissible but bad and therefore really requires a teaching engagement. And you've got to kind of ramp up your teaching. That's sort of one piece, kind of conceptual confusion. But then we have this other challenge at Harvard where we are, literally the most decentralized university in the country, I think. Okay. And I came from the University of Chicago originally. I spent my first 10 years on the faculty there. And at Chicago, everybody always says, we are the most decentralized university in the country. But the truth is, even Chicago, highly decentralized university, has a university-wide faculty senate. And that fact matters a lot because it actually means that across schools, you have a venue for communicating around policy. And for those things that actually need to be stable at a university-wide level, you have a way of starting to achieve that stability. So President Garber in January tried to start giving us stability around protest policies with his important email on that subject. But we are sort of weaker at generating that kind of stability at Harvard because of the lack of that university-wide faculty senate. That was a long-winded answer. I apologize.
That was great, and I think that was terrific. I want to, now turn to some students, and maybe we'll start with you, Danny. You've heard Danielle outline kind of this vision. Can you share of your own experience, and also are there some things that you want to either challenge Danielle on or ask her about? I think would be a good opportunity. And I do also want to make sure I make it very clear to our audience, each of our students, and certainly Danielle, are speaking on their own behalf tonight, not on behalf of Harvard Hillel, and they are sharing their experiences, and certainly don't represent the full gamut of experiences that students have. But Danny, please go ahead.
Yeah, no, thank you, Rabbi. Yeah, thank you so much for joining us, Professor Allen. I really enjoyed reading through your columns last night in preparation for this. I think it felt really nice to sort of step back from being in the midst of what feels like a giant storm and to sort of try to pluck out like what are some sort of like fundamental philosophical concepts that we can like apply to this, especially in order to improve the situation on campus. So thank you so much for writing the column that you're writing. I guess I would like to take the encampment as sort of like an isolated incident to discuss, if that's okay. And sort of outline sort of three of my main thoughts about it, two of which have to do with things that you've written in your column. So in your column, um, in your column that you most recently wrote, which we talked a little about before we started this, you spoke about sort of vigilante actors, and how if one of the ways to stop vigilante actors is to have sort of an entity that applies its policies a bit more forcefully. Um, and I just wanted to sort of, yeah, sort of talk about the encampment in that respect, because the way I feel that protests work generally is that they're sort of like um, pushing up against the rules that apply. And you sort of also talked about in a different article, I think, that Harvard should set out sort of a map of campus where we can have areas of free speech. We can have times and place where, free speech is acceptable, maybe inside some buildings, maybe outside. Um, and I guess I would just like to ask you, like, how do you deal with the fact that whatever rules are put in place, organizations like the PSC want to push them and want to um, they want to break the rules because that is how they are seen. Like if there is a protest, if protests are acceptable between 8 a.m. and 8 p.m., in this building, they're going to do it somewhere else at a different time. So I just wanted to sort of ask your thoughts about that. But also sort of, I've talked to students, in the yard who feel just very, they feel like the environment in the yard is very hostile. There's some students who are getting hotels. There's a student who I talked to, a freshman who I talked to today, who was interviewed by the Crimson, because the Crimson was doing a report on students affected by the encampments, and the student said, this is a hostile space for me. I feel incredibly uncomfortable with this space. And the reporter kept asking, but was there a noise violation? Was this rule broken or was this rule broken? And the student just felt incredibly unheard by this reporting. Um, just because something doesn't fall within the exact rules, doesn't mean it doesn't really affect, people in the campus. I also want to talk about the encampment in relation to just inequity with other clubs. So far, I'm a part of Hillel. I'm not speaking on Hillel right now on behalf of Hillel, but so far Hillel generally has been playing by the rules, whatever that means, of university policy, with our protests, with our memorials. So what is our incentive to continue doing this, following the rules, other than just respect for university policy, when there's another organization who is allowed to break the rules time and time again? And for more of a specific example, every year Chabad puts up a menorah in the yard for Hanukkah. And every year the university says that they can't keep the menorah up overnight for fear of vandalism. So it just feels to me like an incredible inequity when an entire encampment is able to be kept up in the yard and we aren't even allowed to have one menorah held overnight. And then sort of the third realm that I want to talk about is just address the claim that the PSC is making that this is a free speech issue, that the university is suppressing free speech. And this is a little bit less related to your column and more just my feelings on the matter, which you can speak to or not. But this claim is really pulling a lot of other people in because they see it as like the university is suppressing pro-Palestinian voices on our campus and they need to revolt against it. But from my perspective, people are walking around with keffiyehs to mostly no pushback. BDS was endorsed by the Crimson editorial board, 2 years ago. And in classes, generally anti-Israel voices go unchallenged. And for me personally, the only place that I feel truly socially safe being Zionist is Hillel or Chabad. So and I understand it's okay to be uncomfortable. I'm okay being uncomfortable, but what I'm not really intellectually okay with is for the PSC to claim their voice is being silenced by the university, when the majority of young people are pro-Palestinian generally. Um, yes, that's what I would say. I hope I gave you something to respond to there.
I think
But
you
Yeah,
gave
no,
a
you
lot.
do
So
plenty. Exactly. Rabbi, shall I proceed
yeah, I
or?
think it'll be good for you to respond, and then we'll go to our other students.
Sure, of course. Well, first of all, just to say thank you for sharing, because it's hard to share from personal experience in a public forum. So I appreciate your doing that. And it's important because we have to have a very concrete understanding of what people are experiencing in order to be able to find our way to solutions for the hard challenges we have on our campus. So thank you for that. For starters, I think it's really important to say that we do have massive opportunity for expressive speech, for political speech on our campus at all kinds of times and places. And there is definitely a difference between using those incredible, probably ultimately like infinite number of opportunities for speech and choosing to use a method that involves breaking the rules. There just is a difference between those things. So in some sense, I think your question is fundamentally about how should universities handle civil disobedience? That is, say, when people are intentionally breaking the rules, and that's what they are choosing to do. Because yes, I mean, one could say simply to folks in the encampment, well, consider the many other ways you have of making your views available and known. So clearly, there is another choice that's been made on the part of those who are participating in the encampment. So it's not really about free speech, which is abundantly available. It is very specifically about civil disobedience. Now, so then there's a sort of set of questions. You asked, well, let me actually back up. I did want to say one thing about the menorah. I mean, that one just seems to me actually kind of straightforward, that there should be protection there should just be sort of security protection for menorah overnight. Like that just seems to me very straightforward and shouldn't be a kind of complicated question. So let me just say that on that one. But then back to your bigger issue. Once you have civil disobedience, which is specifically about breaking the rules, then the university does have a responsibility to protect the rules, to respond by enforcing them. So as the students have received ad board sanctions, that's completely appropriate and it's what should be done. I think you also are in, at this point, a kind of very difficult, complicated situation, balancing a number of different considerations, trying to, resolve a situation with minimal harm. And so I can't know everything, say President Garber knows and so forth, and, how and why they're making the kinds of decisions that they're making. But I think it's important to say that, like, that's what this is fundamentally about. It is about civil disobedience. It's not just about free speech. One core principle is that, yes, the civil disobedient action should bring a penalty if it's a rule breaking one. And then, there's the kind of, aside from that question, the resolution question, the challenge of how one brings a process of civil disobedience to resolution. And for that, I think there are honestly just a multiplicity of possible answers that are very situationally dependent. That doesn't change the fact that, like, they're all hard, okay? So, like, they're all hard, there are no good options, all right? I mean, I think that's sort of roughly the circumstance. So then why should others continue to invest in the multiplicity of free speech spaces that are inside the rules, as opposed to also adopting a stance of civil disobedience? I think that's a very good and hard question. I come from, my granddad helped found one of the first chapters of the NAACP in Northern Florida in the 1940s. That was super dangerous work. Lynchings were on the rise at the time, so he was literally taking his life into his hands. And so at various points in time, that organization absolutely made choices to engage in civil disobedience. There are processes of judgment, I think, that are about, when has one come to the end of the road about what is possible for people to do? My hope would be that on this campus, we would not put people in the position of feeling that they'd come to the end of the road in terms of their ability to express important views and make space for necessary conversations. So my hope would be that on this campus, that what we, the faculty, could do collectively is make space for the conversations that we need to have to help everybody understand with more subtlety, the range of issues at stake in the conflict between Israel and Hamas, situation in Gaza, and so forth. And I think that that's kind of the number one responsibility of a teaching organization. And if we can make that space real and substantive, then my hope would be that student organizations that you might be part of, for example, wouldn't feel that they were at the end of the road with what free speech inside the sort of structure of rules can make possible by way of real debate, real engagement, productive problem-solving sort of deliberation. I hope that made some sense. Again, I know that was a kind of a meandering answer, but I hope that made some sense and was responsive to what you were asking about.
I think that's very good. Danny, if you want to ask anything very briefly, just to follow up, because I want to make sure that Eliana and Jacob have a chance also.
Yeah, no, I'll pass it on. I need to do some thinking.
Okay.
These are hard questions, so we all need to do some thinking. I'm doing some thinking here too. You're hearing it out loud. That's why it's meandering. So,
I want to turn to Elian now. Elian, you're Israeli. You're a veteran of the IDF. Often that can be the most challenging experiences on campus. So, can you share a little bit for our audience what things have been like for you this year, and reflect a little bit in light of what Danielle has shared so far?
Yeah. Apologies for the bulky earphones. It's a little bit noisy in here. So as the rabbi mentioned, I am a senior here. And as my time kind of comes to an end, I started weighing my expectations about Harvard with my experience at Harvard. So I'll start with one of my main expectations, which I think is the most relevant. I expected this place to be a space where I can have complicated conversations with people. Yep. I actually expected sitting with Palestinian students on equal grounds and trying to have conversations about the conflict, trying to come up with solutions, or at least some friendships. And sadly, that hasn't been my experience. So kind of circling back to 4 years ago, when I came here for a recruitment visit, I had some conversation with one of the athletes on my team that isn't Palestinian, isn't Jewish, and isn't Israeli, about my opinion regarding a two-state solution, which is favorable, not that it should matter, but I am a very left-leaning Israeli, so I am pro two-state solution. I had some conversation about it. And later on, I found out that some of the other athletes on the team went to my coach and asked for her not to recruit me because of my political opinions, which thankfully she didn't listen and she still recruited me. But I already kind of felt the sense of even being pro two-state solution, even being very liberal, even being very open-minded is something that is not acceptable by the students, not necessarily the faculty at that point. And then I got to Harvard and I started facing some more issues. So one of the issues that was prominent and kind of refers to that expectation of having conversations with people you disagree with is when me and my fellow Israelis were running and organizing Israel Trek. And Israel Trek is a trip for 100 students that is fully led by students. And the goal of it is to show 100 students in the college Israel and even spend a day and a half or 2 days in Palestine, in the West Bank. And as we were organizing it, we wanted to have some weigh-in from Palestinian students and even from the PSC regarding our days in the West Bank, because we didn't want to, what they would claim is whitewashing. And when we reached out to them and asked to just have a conversation, they immediately rejected our offer. And later on, when we tried and asked one of the Israeli students that is Arab Israeli, or what a lot of people here would call Palestinian citizen of Israel, to engage with them, they basically shunned him just for being able and being open to conversing with us and leading the trip with us. And that's when I realized that people here are not necessarily open. Not only are they not open for conversation, but they reject conversation completely. And then not to mention that we had a lot of incidents where some Israelis were kind of passed on for final clubs because of their identity as being Israeli. Not to mention that one of the Israeli students in this university was basically asked to leave a class that she wasn't attending, but she came to watch one of her friends' presentation. And she basically was asked by the professor or the preceptor to leave the classroom because her being present in the room made people feel like they're unsafe and they're not able to talk about their opinions safely. And then the pinnacle of my expectations being shattered was the 8th of October. So the 7th of October, horrible day, I opened my phone. I realized that some of my family members have been taken hostage, or allegedly at that point. Some of them were later found dead. Some of them were taken hostage. I find out that some of my friends from high school were at the party. Some of them died. Some of them were raped. Some of them had to hide while hearing their friends being raped and murdered. And the 8th of October, I see the PSC's letter. And I understand that freedom of speech in the US is very different than freedom of speech elsewhere, freedom of speech in Israel in particular. But that was when my expectations completely shriveled into nothing, because I sat and I thought to myself, as someone who is very liberal, as someone who is very progressive, when I speak about my experience, I get denied from the liberal community that I've thought that I'm a part of for the longest time. And not only that, I see that the school is unable to put a coherent message out there saying that while maybe it's okay that they make these statements and they're allowed to make these statements according to the law, that they don't endorse it. And not that they only don't endorse it, they reject it as a university, and they reject students making these claims at their university. And then rolling out to the encampment, which of course, this is breaking the rules, so it shouldn't even be a matter of freedom of speech or whatnot, because it explicitly says on a little plaque that you're not allowed to stay there overnight. But the whole conversation that is being had here is about noise complaints. And like Danny mentioned, it's all about, but is there noise? But are you being bothered? But are you trying to study for your exams, and is it bothering you? Well, I think the issue should be, what do we do when students, whether or not they understand what they're saying, are calling for the incitement of violence? And really, the issue is not the fact that they're making noise, because if they were having a party at the yard, I would have no issue with that. The issue is that they're calling for an intifada, which I cannot see how people in the universe can understand it as a phrase to not mean violence. And calling for a one-state Palestinian solution on the land of Israel, Palestine, whatever you would like to call it. And just a little, sorry to add a little bit piece of my personal frustration, but the week of the 7th of October, as I'm attending Zoom funerals, I sat with Dean Karana and I iterated to him, showing to him posts of students that were highly anti-Semitic. No line, no kind of walking the line and edging towards like anti-Zionism, anti-Israel, purely anti-Semitic. I sat with him, he understood it to be 100% anti-Semitic, and I asked him, what do we do with these students? I'm not asking you to suspend them. I'm not asking you to put them on academic probation. I'm asking you to have a conversation with them. I would expect if my peers were to post pro-KKK post on their Instagram, that at least their dean would take them and sit with them for a conversation and say, look, I think you're misguided. I think you're posting things that you might not understand what they're meaning, and we should at least have a discussion about it. And Dean Karana's response was, I'm not in charge of what the deans do. The deans can do whatever they want to be doing. And then I asked him if he's willing to sit and have a conversation with them. He said that he's willing to facilitate a conversation between myself and them. And not only did he not deliver through on facilitating the conversation, but he didn't even speak to them themselves. He promised me to have another conversation with me. He never had another conversation with me. We had a bunch of email chains going on back and forth about the encampment. It seems like the university is more concerned with noise complaints than the actual language and the actual activities and engagement that the people on the camp are doing. He had a few conversations with other Jewish and Israeli concerned people on campus, and basically the answer was nothing is gonna be done. And not only that, we don't even have a plan or a path forward to how we create a campus that has some sort of civil discourse around topics that they find hard. And just wanted to step a little bit away from the Israeli and Jewish, but I think this is a greater issue. I think I forgot the name of the swimmer that came to speak here, but she was speaking about her experience competing against Leah Thomas, and not that I agree with the swimmer's perspective or anything like that. I don't necessarily have a big opinion around this, but the uproar of campus that someone that they disagree with is coming here is just insane. And I think that Harvard, I don't know exactly what Harvard does to create this system, but I think Harvard needs to take responsibility of what is happening on campus and understand that they have some sort of something that Harvard is doing, and something about the Harvard education is creating and facilitating this environment where no one can say anything that any other person can disagree with, or that the majority, will disagree with. So sorry for it to go on a little bit of a rant, and I don't necessarily have a solution at mind, but what I do know is that people on this campus are from my perspective, calling for the incitement of violence. And on the other hand, people like me who are trying to engage with civil discourse and speak to Palestinians are getting rejected immediately. People like me are going and introducing themselves as Israeli, are getting rejected immediately from finals clubs, from athletic clubs. And so, yeah, I'm wondering what is the path forward that Harvard is going to take, as well as what do you think is the contribution of Harvard as an institution to creating this environment on campus?
Well, thank you, Eliane, for sharing at such length, and again, so personally. And I mean, first of all, and most importantly, I'm just so profoundly sorry for the losses in your family and friends that you have experienced. That's just devastating. And I couldn't be more sorry. And I know that makes no difference whatsoever. I recognize that those kinds of words make no difference. But I am deeply, I'm so sorry. So in a sense, I'm grateful to you for wanting to talk about the university against the backdrop of experiences of loss as profound as that. It's extraordinary, really, that you want to talk about the question of how the university can be healthy. So thank you for keeping your focus on that and that commitment to those core values, the idea that we are a place that should meet the kind of expectation that you came here with, namely that people coming from very different backgrounds and experiences will be able to keep intellectual space wide open so that we can do the hard work together. It does pain me to hear your accounts of the very many ways in which that expectation has gone unfulfilled during your time at Harvard. I mean, I can't pretend to feel anything other than pain about it, because it is also my expectation for what this place can and should be. So the question that you're then asking is, given where we are, A, what do I think about how we got here? And B, where do we go? I don't think I have a very good global answer, but what I can do is just say a little bit about, as a faculty member, the kinds of things I do, the kinds of things I have sort of undertaken in order to try to make the kind of difference that you're describing. So just to be very concrete, I mean, this is old at this point, but back in, I want to say 2018, there was a period, that was another period, already a kind of hot period of lots of cancellations happening on college campuses. And at Middlebury College, somebody invited Charles Murray to speak, the author of The Bell Curve, lots of concerns about, in effect, sort of racist frameworks and so forth in his work. And at Middlebury, this provoked a literal riot, physical riot, in which people were injured, including a faculty member. And shortly after Charles Murray was at Middlebury, he was invited to come to Harvard. And students came to see me, starting with the view that it should be canceled in some fashion, that it should be blocked from going forward. And my response to the students was to say, no, this is what we're here for. If one of our members of our community has issued an invitation, we protect their right to issue that invitation under the principle of academic freedom. It is the job of each and every one of us to be seeking to make good judgments about what counts as a valuable contribution to the intellectual debate on our campus. I may disagree with that judgment, but I do not get to block it or hinder it. Instead, I have to make space. So when somebody invites somebody with whom one disagrees profoundly, the right kind of response is rather to counter-program, again, to keep the intellectual space open. By counter-program, I don't mean a protest. I mean a substantive event that directly engages with the work at issue. In this case, I encourage the students to actually spend time reading Charles Murray's work and to figure out what they thought was wrong with it, and then run an event that focused on those aspects and components. And that's what, in fact, happened. So I know it's possible for us to do things differently on this campus. And I think the question you're really asking is, I know there are lots of faculty, I'm not alone in moments like that, doing small things to try to keep that intellectual space open. And so I think the question you're really asking is, what can we do to make a bigger space, make it easier for people to do things like that and keep the space open for everybody? So I want to make sure we have time to hear from Jacob as well. So I think I'm going to have to leave it with that same how question that you asked, Elian. You said you didn't have answers. I also do not have an answer to give you right at this moment. But again, I want to appreciate your maintaining a commitment to the core values of this institution, even under such duress.
Thank you. Jacob, you are a co-chair of the editorial board of the Harvard Crimson. You've edited Danielle's pieces. The Crimson's been a place that shared a lot of different perspectives. And I'm curious, I'm sure a lot of it is confidential, but can you talk a little bit about your experience, probably actually having some kind of engagement with people who really disagree in some kind of substantive way, in which you've also had to reach some practical conclusions?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Thank you so much. And, it's been a pleasure editing your pieces, Professor Allen. The Crimson, to my understanding, is unique in the sense that I don't think discussions across quite literally the largest, spread of student opinion on these issues is occurring anywhere besides the Crimson's editorial board. We have, leaders in the pro-Israel community at Hillel and at Chabad, as well as leadership of the Palestine Solidarity Committee, and it's really the only place on campus where discussions are happening. And so, I see some kind of amount of hope that we can have as an institution towards kind of having these conversations. I will say, I'm not going to speak about kind of the internal process of the Crimson, but overall as a student at the school, I've been a little upset at kind of the lack of dialogue that we have. And I think a big part of the issue stems from a lack of education. The encampment isn't really kind of academic speech, it's a form of protest. We're not really having kind of nuanced intellectual conversations about the situation in Israel and in Gaza. There are a lot of slogans that are being thrown around. I really appreciate what you've written about the distinction between, permissible but bad speech. There's a lot, if someone chants intifada, I would argue that's permissible but bad speech. But it's not just bad in the sense that it's kind of uncomfortable to Jewish students. I think it's really regressive when it comes to the conversations that we're having. Because I think it becomes a lot more difficult to have a productive conversation about the situation in Israel and in the West Bank and in Gaza when a significant portion of students on one side are calling for an intifada. And I don't mean to kind of overly generalize. I don't think that's necessarily the case with everyone. But that's kind of the rhetoric that is emerging. At least we've seen videos from the encampment. And I guess the other thing I'll say is, I think there are a handful of people in the Palestine Solidarity Committee who are probably very educated on the issue. I'd imagine the people who kind of come from the region have substantial knowledge about the issue, but at least kind of my understanding from kind of what I've seen on campus is that a lot of people don't really have a deep understanding of the issue. And so in order to have productive conversations, it's not going to be enough to kind of get rid of the divisive rhetoric and bring everyone to the table. There needs to be a kind of deep like educational effort to ensure that people are armed with facts and know what the situation is on the ground. I think it's very hard to like be able to opine on this if you haven't been to Israel and been to the West Bank and spoken with both Israelis and Palestinians. And I think people really do need to educate themselves if we're going to make any progress.
I agree with you, Jacob, and I can tell you, what I've been hungry for myself in this time, which is very similar actually to what you just expressed. And actually, Elian, this might be a bit more of an answer to your question as well. So I had an interesting experience this spring. I was speaking at BYU in Utah. And I speak at lots of universities. So I, wasn't really thinking much about it in advance. And my bad habit is the day before I kind of look at my calendar and figure out what exactly I'm supposed to be doing. And it said there'll be 5,000 people at this thing. It's like 5,000 people. What? What are you talking about? I'm like, where do you even have an event with 5,000 people? And I read a little further. It's like in the basketball arena, of course. That's where you have an event with 5,000 people. I was like, well, holy moly, what does this mean? Like an event with 5,000 people. And it turns out that what it meant is that at BYU, there are no classes from 11 to 1 every Tuesday. Okay? No classes, 11 to 1. Why? Because there's a university-wide convening every week. And it's BYU, so it's a religious school, right? It's a Church of Latter-day Saints school. So they alternate. One week they have a secular speaker on some sort of academic theme that the community considers it important to be learning about. And then the second week they have a devotional. They go back and forth between the sort of secular and the devotional. So I was one of the secular speakers. And so I was there to talk about issues of cultural pluralism, confident pluralism, and so forth on campuses. At any rate, so I have had this fantasy this year, this sort of appetite for what would it be like? I should have added, the president presides, right? So the president, the provost, and these are all there. So in other words, the academic leadership of the campus is also the intellectual leadership of the campus. So that's been my fantasy. I would love to see President Garber, Provost Manning, sitting in Sanders Theater once a week for 2 hours with the best possible speakers from different sides of the spectrum, political spectrum and ideological spectrum, each week walking through these hard issues, exactly the ones you just named. The history of the region. We all have incredibly uneven knowledge about that. Why can't Harvard get the 3 or 4 best speakers in the world who can give us the history of the region from the very different perspectives of the Israeli perspective, the Palestinian perspective, et cetera, et cetera. The history of the different kinds of solutions that have been proposed, 2-state solutions, the different kinds of accords that have been developed, what have been the stumbling blocks, why have we not been able to break through on these things, et cetera. Like, again, that one will probably take a few weeks, right? But again, this is Harvard. Like, why can't we get the best people to just sort of do that? We do protect time. For example, Tuesday afternoons in FAS, there aren't classes from 3 to 5 because that's our kind of canonical faculty meeting time. So it seems like there ought to be a way of like using a structure of that kind to actually let us have a shared intellectual experience on this campus. But we haven't. We don't have access to shared intellectual experiences. And I think, honestly, that's the thing that we're all kind of hungrier for than anything else.
Thank you. Anna Jacob has to hop off.
Thank you so much.
with only 2 minutes left until 8 p.m., I think we'll conclude our evening. But Danielle, I really wanted to thank you. Something that I was very much struck by in one of your articles was that you talked about the role of faculty and staff as a pastoral role. That part of the education process is to be
Right.
pastoral. And I think you've demonstrated to us we certainly haven't solved the major issues here this evening, but just to begin a conversation of what it means as a faculty, I think, to listen to students, demonstrate care, and to try and respond and do so sincerely and at the highest level. You just fielded some very tough experiences and questions, and you did so, I think, with patience and fortitude. And I think you've done that in your writing. And so that really is a model, I think, for all faculty at Harvard, and something that I'm very grateful for. I hope our students are as well, and I'm sure that our audience is too. And so I hope that this can be the beginning of being an inspiration for that kind of leadership from Harvard's faculty. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you. I appreciate your generosity, and I appreciate your invitation to me to join you. And again, Danny and Eliane, really appreciate your sharing from your really hard experiences. So thank you for doing that with me.
I just want to share one final word. Our incoming executive director, who starts in about 4 weeks, Rabbi Jason Rubenstein, was on a Hartman podcast this week. I encourage everyone to listen. And the final question he was asked was, what do you hope for in kind of your first 100 days when you begin? And he himself is a Harvard alum and had a very influential experience at Hillel. And he said that, I'm reading an AI transcript here, that he hopes that Hillel will provide a place and a set of experiences where our capacity to believe in things that are beyond what we currently believe as plausible or even possible is restored. And I think for many of us right now is not just incredibly painful, but I think it can be hard to have hope that we're heading in the right direction. And that is going to be a very long process and a hard one.
Yep.
But Danielle, I think this evening with you, at least for me, restored a bit of that sense that maybe actually a new reality is possible. And I'm very grateful to you.
Thank you. Likewise, I to you. We have to do it all together for sure. So.
And
Yeah.
Eliane and Danny, and also to Jacob, thank you for sharing personally. These are difficult experiences to have, to continue to talk about, to do so in a public forum. We had about 400 people on the call this evening, and I'm sure all of them are better off for having heard directly from you. So thank you for your own courage and sharing. I want to wish everyone a good evening, and we'll stay tuned for more programs we'll be hosting in the upcoming weeks. But until then, thank you again to Danielle, Jacob, Eliane, and Danny, and to all of you for joining. Have a wonderful night.
Take care. You too. Be well. And good luck with finals, both of you. All right.
Thank you.
Do it.
Yeah.